Well, what can Democrats do apart from what they're already doing? And I'm here to tell you because it's not within tradition. Because had tradition been used during the Holocaust, we would not have prosecuted lawful actions. The Nuremberg trials literally created international criminal law, it created international human rights law, and it created international refugee law. So prior to that, there was no reality in which you can hold a sovereign nation accountable for their governance that is lawful within their authority, right? So in this reality, we created unprecedented solutions from an unprecedented conflict. That's what we're experiencing right now, an unprecedented conflict. To think that legislation will be the one to change it, no. To think that the courts will be the one to change it, no. Because what's the end to the rule of law? That is tyranny. When tyranny begins and the courts accept it, that means anarchy at the bottom. Is the executive going to fix it? No, because they're just going to reshape the rule of law. You see, representatives cannot go into the detention centers because they're not detention centers, they're processing centers. Marines cannot arrest you, but they can detain you. Bounty hunters can get you, and it doesn't matter because you don't actually know whether they're, official DHS or bounty hunters because they're all masked and aren't required to show their identities. In this reality, like during the Holocaust, those traditional channels will not work. So there are three options that I've come to a conclusion will be beneficial if, we want an actual solution. One is civil unrest that results in the Joint Chiefs of Staff acknowledging that there is going to be a constitutional collapse, which we are experiencing. But since they do not see it, they do not hear it, they don't have the urgency to say, maybe we have to do something about this, administration, which ultimately they can forcibly, lawfully remove them. The second one is we take inspiration from the fact that when Canada and all these other countries started to put tariffs on the United States, the GOP started having anxiety and changing their votes. So now reality, blue states removing federal funding from the administration, from the federal government, can produce that anxiety that will allow for them to actually, at the bare minimum, maybe impeach him or go against his agenda. Because what you are not realizing is that the budget will pass. In fact, the budget that the Senate moved past to the House made it even harder for us to hold them in contempt, right? The federal government, and it's made it much more expensive. Why? Because they have lawyers that they can fucking use in order to challenge the Constitution. Lawyers have no respect for the constitutional order, and Justice Sotomayor said this, that law schools don't teach respect for the Constitution because they see the Constitution as something that they have to challenge. And in fact, these are what these attorneys are doing, right? These Trump attorneys are challenging the constitutional order and provoking that in a way in which they can manipulate it so that you believe that it's lawful. So in this reality, to pressure this, blue state governors must have that backbone in order to challenge the federal government at all capacities, including economic harm, right? Because then, only then, can Congress have some of their own medicine and knowing that maybe they have to go in alignment with that constitutional order and remove the problem so that it can be restored. The third one is a CW, and that's it. CW. I don't know how that's going to work out. I don't know how that's going to, but ultimately we have three options that are outside of the norm. I believe a CW would start like the revolution, which is the Boston Massacre, right? Where, Americans were harmed. In that reality, we reacted. And this reality, it's possible that this may be done by bounty hunters because they seem less trained and less capable of actually going, in a way that is much more in tune with the protocols. Already, the official agents like that as well because they're January 6ers, right? But ultimately, it's going to be done from that avenue, and then we have to split between those who support the rogue feds and those who support we the people. In that reality, those are the three options. It's not gonna be because of the political willingness to be bipartisan, because when you are bipartisan with tyranny, you are endorsing it. That is why the Democrats voting in line with the Republicans removes the argument that they are a one-party rule, removes the argument that it's tyranny, because in fact they are allowing for them through giving them their blessing. So in this reality, we have to admit that what the Democrats have been positioning as an entity, not as individuals, because there are people with backbones, is what? It is a failure to defend and a failure to actually rise up to what's needed in order to ensure that we restore our constitutional order, because that's going to require not doing legislation, not doing courts, but doing actions that may get you in trouble. Gavin Newsom may be having to find some threats from the federal government in regards to his own safety and his own liberty and his capacity to ignore that and contain within California opposition that is much more independent than would be if the constitutional order was secure, because right now what we have is a crisis, which means that the state government gets much more power. But if they're scared, like Gavin Newsom, who are scared about funding and fires and all that stuff, or Minnesota, who's scared of the political violence because, she went for a GOP policy and she still got. And now, Tim Walz is saying, like, we should kumbaya and compassion, all of this. That didn't beat the Holocaust. If anything, the Illinois governor, J.B. Pritzker, is the only one who actually acknowledges how serious this is. In this reality, we have to get away from decorum. We have to get away from the status quo. When you think of what Democrats can do, it is not what they are doing right now, because that is the bare minimum. They need to do more, and that means going outside of the legalities of status quo and go to non-traditional law, which is, again, what stopped the Holocaust. Non-traditional law needs those guidance from American constitutionalism. We talked about John Locke the other day, right? When there is someone who encroaches on their actual authorities, that is a act of violence. In our reality, that's either going to be reacted by our state commander-in-chief, or it's going to be reacted by the people. Now, it's assumed by me that politicians, primarily Democrats, would rather we shed our blood than they shed theirs, right? Because they don't see any urgency to this. Some of them think it's just the pendulum swinging. So in this reality, we have to think of what we are willing to commit to in order to ensure that tyranny does not win. And whether that is led by political elected people who have the backbone to lead that, or whether it's led through community members who have to force that, we have to acknowledge that we cannot depend on the traditional mechanisms to fix this, and you cannot excuse their unwillingness by saying they're doing everything they can. No, they are not, because Alexander Hamilton positioned within our originalist thoughts the avenues in which we can choose to go from here. And the reality that we're not going through those because we want to take care of the law first, which the law never ends tyranny, because by the time law does anything, it's already too late. How many Jews were returned after the Nuremberg trials? How many natives were returned after the Trail of Tears? It doesn't actually fix anything, and that's why I didn't go to law school, because I'm like, well, ultimately, I'm not going to actually produce any change, because I'm not fixing anything. I'm just fixing certain cases. I'm not fixing the problem, right? If you're helping women who are getting S8, are you actually helping the fact that throughout the different levels, including the police department, they get ignored, including, the prosecutor, they get ignored, including society, they get ignored. The fact there's legislation about it, yet a judge can say it was just 20 minutes of fun, so I'm going to give him 6 months. That reality really made me break away from traditional law, because ultimately it's not about justice and fairness, it's about rules and regulations. And if a tyrant creates and readapts those rules and regulations, lawyers have to commit to that. Politicians don't, but because we have so much lawyers in the government, then they believe that they do. But ultimately, we have non-traditional law, and that's what we have to move forward in order to find a solution. It's not going to be done through the traditional lenses, and that's what we see in history when it comes to tyranny. Rule of law, nor decorum, nor compassion fixes tyranny. It has to be opposition, and very bold opposition.